Hi all, this is the MakeHaven badging video for our tube roller here at MakeHaven. The idea behind the tube roller is to take tubes or pipes and roll them through here until you get them to have a nice curve to them. You can't get really tight bends, that's what you use a tube bender for, but these can get, down to maybe 2 foot diameter bends, which is pretty good, or maybe even better with practice, depending on what kind of material you're doing. A quick terminology thing, tube versus pipe can get pretty confusing. Pipe is measured by the internal diameter. So if you imagine the inside of it, the ID, the internal diameter, if that's 1/2 inch, if it's 1/2 inch pipe, then that is a 1/2 inch. If it's a 1/2 inch tube, it's measured from the outside diameter. So a 1/2 inch tube is smaller than a 1/2 inch pipe. But this will do either tube or pipe. You just need to be sure you know what you're talking about when you are talking about the size of dies that you're going to use. So let's talk about the different pieces on the machine. These are called dies, D-I-E-S, and you can purchase different dies from this company. We have just the most basic one here that has 4 different circular sizes ranging from a 1/2 inch to a 1/4 inch, and you need 3 of them. So there's these 2 that are driven, and then the middle one the upper one is the drive die that you turn with the handle. And it rolls the material through it back and forth until it gets to whatever curve you want. It's not super precise. This one tries to be a little more precise than some, but it definitely is a little bit of an art form. So these are the dies, upper and lower dies. You can set them in different positions, which we'll get to in a minute. And then you can adjust the height of the upper die by moving in here. There's a jack that you'll be able to see in a second that moves the upper die up and down. And so that's how you can adjust the position and therefore how much curve it makes. You always start with just a little bit of curve and then go down and down and down until you get to where you want. Going back and forth each time, making sure to be gentle. This is a very heavy duty machine, but it's fairly easy to destroy if you push it too hard. So if you have some heavy steel tube and you set it and you pushed it a 1/2 inch or something in a pass, it'll just destroy the axles and bearings, and it'll be a mess, an expensive mess. Up here is what's called a DRO, a digital readout. This shows you how far down the upper die is, so you can try to be more repeatable about your bends. You can say for a certain piece of metal, each time you're going to go until a certain depth, and that can make it more repeatable. Then in terms of safety, you just really don't want to get pinched in here. So you want to make sure your fingers aren't anywhere where as you're rolling, it'll get pinched. In terms of keeping the tools safe, we have grease here, which you apply to the drive die, the top one, to make sure that it's nice and lubricated, doesn't get pinched. And then, like we said earlier, you just take nice, shallow, small increments. Also, this doesn't turn off on its own, so just make sure to turn it off when you're done so you don't kill the battery. So we have this most basic set of dies, but if you want a different size or shape, then you need to purchase it. You can go to swagoffroad.com. I'll make sure to put the link in the description. And from that site, you can get different dies. They're about $180 a piece. You also need to make sure to get the axles with them. So it's about $200 of investment to get different shapes and sizes. They have a lot of different shapes and sizes for all different profiles and whatnot. They have these wheels made out of plastic too, so if you're turning or bending something soft, rolling something soft, then you can get those so it doesn't damage the material. And then you're welcome to keep that, or as we get more of them, then we can make shelves down here to store them here if you feel inclined to donate them to MakeHaven. So let's say we had different sets of dies to choose from. We'll look at taking the process of taking it in and out. So these, the two driven dies or lower dies, come out like that, and they have a collar on either side to hold it in the middle. So we'll set it in the middle, and then just that end cap to take it off. All of the Allen keys live on the top of the tube roller, and they're labeled so you know which one goes where. And then if we wanted to take this one out, then in this case we would grab the upper shaft collar's Allen key, and it goes right in here. And then inside there's a shaft key. So I'm just loosening those set screws just a little bit, and now we can pull this out. And I'm going to put my hand in here so we don't drop it. Pull this out, and now we can see inside of here that there's this piece of key stock. So this is what engages this die to the handle. So it's important not to lose this. But then let's say we were putting a new die in, we would take this, we would make sure to have that key stock in there, and have the key stock on the bottom, and then lift it right up in here, and put the handle in with that handle facing downwards so the key slot, keyway lines up. And then you just wiggle it back in. Ta-da, just like that. And then we take this guy and tighten it right back up. It's important to keep the dies clean, because if there's little bits and pieces of gunk and metal shavings in there, then it'll get pressed into the dies and into your material, so it's important to keep those nice and clean. Then for these, we're going to drop the dies right back in. These dies slide into these grooves. So when you are rolling something, you always start in the outermost slots. And the reason for that is that it makes the shallowest bend, which is the easiest for the machine. You would only move in to these inner slots if you need to get a tighter radius on your bend. But that makes it much harder on the machine, on all the axles and bearings. So you would only do that at the end. So you start all the way out here, get as tight as you can, and then move it in. So we'll start by having these all the way out here. And these collars are still loose, so we have to make sure to center those. So right now they're still loose and can slide around. And I just grabbed this piece of aluminum. It's 1/4 inch aluminum solid stock, so we can try to roll this. And we're gonna start by making sure it's clean. There's no pieces of metal and whatnot on there. And I'm just gonna lay this right in here. I put it in backwards, so I'm gonna have to flip that around. So I flopped that top die around, so now they're all lined up. And now what we're going to do is make sure that these rollers, the dies, are all lined up with each other. So I'm just setting it in the groove, and then I'm going to lower that top one down far enough so that it can engage. So I'm going to use this pump handle on the back side. So this just goes right in here, and you need to make sure that this is tightened. So when you loosen it, it lets this whole assembly come up. And there are big springs to help it, but sometimes it even needs more of a helping hand because it's so heavy. So now it's up. We're going to tighten it, and then we can bring it down. So using this handle, you just pump the jack. And in this case, we just want to get it low enough so it's just touching our aluminum bar. All right, so it's just touching it there. And now, to center it, we can grab this Allen key labeled lower shaft collars, and these are loose, and the ones back here are now also loose. And so we just make sure that they're nicely aligned so that this is nice and straight. I'm just going to look down the length And this piece of metal isn't terribly straight to begin with. That looks pretty good, so I'm going to tighten down these collars so they can't slide around. And now what we can do is we're going to put some grease on the axle. So this is just some lithium grease. You can put a little on your finger. And I'm just going to turn the handle with my finger, putting grease on it while it's turning. So you get grease all over it so that it turns nicely. This piece of aluminum is pretty skinny and flexy, meaning we'll have to bend it pretty far before it actually deforms into that shape. So, you know, we may need to move these rollers in to get it to do that. So given that this is such a skinny piece, I'm going to go down maybe that much, and we can see on the front, actually, I'm going to release this. Go. So that we can set the 0. So on the DRO, I'm going to crank this down just until it's touching. All right, so it's just touching. I'm going to turn it on and click the 0 button. So now it's at 0 millimeters. So now when we crank down, we know how far we're going. So in general, if you're doing you know, anything that's actually hefty, you know, significant piece of steel, then you should probably only go like 1 or 2, maybe just a few millimeters at a time. Crank it through and get a feel for it to make sure that you're not having to heave on the wheel. If you're doing that, if you're having to crank on this massive lever arm, you're probably wrecking the dies and the bearings. So you can just sort of get a feel for it. But for this, since it's so skinny, we can go down that far, and this probably won't even do anything. Yeah, in fact, it's not even gripping it enough to make it move, so we'll go down a little further. Now, we can go one way. And the other way. Now I'll give it another crank. And I'll give it 2 again, because at this point, if we let it go, it might not even retain that shape. More. So it's important to make sure that you are using a die that actually fits your material. If it doesn't, it will ruin either the material or the die or both. So it's really important to use one that matches, not just like a close fit or an approximation. And then obviously you don't want to run the piece off the end because, well, it'd be very loud, for one. So it looks to me like this piece of metal, when it's coming off of the ends, is still pretty much perfectly straight. So we're bending it a lot in the middle, but that's not actually enough to plastically deform it, which means to bend it enough that it actually changes shape. But if there's were some other metal or it was a little beefier, then it, you know, certainly would be actually having a good roll in it. So we just got to the end of the throw of this jack, the bottle jack, which means that if we want to roll it further, we're going to need to move these rollers, the dies, further in. So what we can do is release this jack. So I'm opening the end and lifting it up. and then closing that green handle that you saw. And then we're going to move these in. So move it into here. In general, you should just move by an increment of 1, but because this is so flexible, we can go to this second one. And they should always mimic each other. Like, they should always be in the same slot. You shouldn't have one in far out and then one in the middle, because then they would be experiencing different forces. All right, so we're going to bring the jack down. And again, that would be very irresponsible if this was strong metal, but you see you can just, bend it with your hand, so it's... All right, we're getting a roll on it. Now you can see that it's kind of going off to one side here. So that means that the rollers probably aren't perfectly aligned. So it could also mean it's just slipping in here. But we want to make sure that to have a nice flat bend, this is staying pretty straight. Make sure it's nice and straight, and we can keep rolling. I might even just keep it straight over here. And then we can give it another push. And now you can see how we're getting a nice curved piece of metal. If you wanted to make this repeatable, if you wanted to do the same bend twice, what you do is just record that you were in the number 2 position, in the 1, 2, and we went down to 40 millimeters. And so if you set that up again, if you went to the second position with the same material and incrementally went down to 40 millimeters, you would get the exact same bend. So if you're doing something where you wanted repeatability, that's how you would do it. So that's pretty much the process. Obviously this is very easy because it's very thin, flexible metal, but it might be much harder depending on what you're doing. When you are done, you're just gonna, you can put the handle piece back on top, make sure that all the Allen keys that belong to it are up here, so we don't lose any parts. And then you're just gonna release, turn that green handle to release it. You can help lift it up a little bit. You have a nice bent piece of aluminum. And then, as it says here, make sure to turn this off when you're done. That's off. Make sure to, you don't have to clean the grease off because the next person's probably going to use it, but if there's any dirt or schmutz, then make sure to clean that off.